Hello and welcome to the Truvle podcast.
Hey everyone.
This week we are talking about, you wanted to go ahead and intro it, Jonathan? Go ahead.
No, please go.
The topic is organizational maturity, one of our favorite topics. And we're really going to talk about it from a high level, from a nuance level. We'll kind of go where it goes. We've got a lot of thoughts on this topic.
And it goes to a general theme that we keep talking about in these podcasts about how could so much waste be created. And one of the reasons is because people have a misperception, or companies have a misperception about what they're capable of accomplishing. And that's really, and then so they end up engaging in all this wasteful activity. And that's one of the areas we'll be covering today in organizational maturity.
Yeah. Maturity, organizational maturity, I feel like has gotten to be one of those terms that's really loaded, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But to Jonathan's point, I think the first dimension we'll talk about is maturity almost as an indicator of self-awareness. Because I think when people talk about maturity, you might think, okay, we're starting to talk about frameworks and measures, and let's say we're at maturity level 1 or 3 or a 5. And to some extent, we'll talk about that too, because that's part of it. But I think even at a very conversational level, a mature organization is one that has more capability, maybe more experience or more competency. They have more in-depth knowledge or expertise in a certain area or industry, let's say. But one would think a more mature organization could do something that a less mature organization or an immature organization could do, but with greater efficiency, greater productivity, less resources, and create more value. So it's a good place, I think, to level set the conversation, because when we're talking about an organization that's mature, you want to assign it kind of what you think as a person who's mature, or a person who's more wise, or somebody you'd go to and think this organization or person knows how to do these things better than maybe somebody with less maturity.
And just so we set some terms here, the standard organizational maturity model starts off on some level of either 1 through 3 phases or 1 through 5. That starts with chaotic, where there's poor governance, maybe poor alignment, uneven tech, things like this, and then it goes all the way to agile, and where you really can just have some transformational idea and you can get it done throughout your organization. And they've extended these models across data governance. So you have data maturity, process maturity, project management maturity, but they all have the same exact idea, as Sam was saying, that there's this idea of capability in terms of asserting what it's trying to do or different things it might want to do. And I think today we're going to focus mostly on low maturity organizations, which seems to be more the norm than anything else. But Sam, I think you were continuing some ideas there, so I just want to level set on some definitions.
Low maturity, exactly. When we talk about maturity, well, it's funny because, as Jonathan mentions, you might think, okay, well, if everyone's low maturity, now that's kind of like the baseline of maturity. That's like saying everyone in my grade is immature, so it's sort of the norm. But I think it's an interesting topic because one can conceive of what a mature organization might look like. Even every immature organization, or what we'd say low maturity organization we work with, who we'd say has lower capabilities, has trouble executing complex projects, they even can conceive that they could be more mature and they're just having trouble getting there, which is sort of an interesting concept if you think about it. Because for us to go around and say, well, the majority of organizations we run into are low and there's so much runway to improve, it's first a commentary on what are the blockers, because I think everyone can conceive of increasing their capability, of being more coordinated, but they're struggling. And that's why they hire, again, from continuing our last conversation, they're hiring consultants, they're trying to improve, but to a certain extent they get caught in this chaotic state or this low maturity state where they can't get over some larger impediments. And I think that's important to mention at this level of conversation, because we're talking about low maturity. It's really only low relative to the sense that we know there's better systems out there and we're just struggling to either implement them or change our culture or get people aligned. And it's an interesting thought, I think, just to start with, because why would we have so much low maturity out there generally?
I'd like to give an analogy here because one of the very interesting things is I often see, like I was saying, entities trying to do things that they can't do. So, for example, I'll come in and they're trying to do some transformative level change, standardize all their processes worldwide, let's say. And then I'll say, how many transformative projects have you done before? We've tried 5. And how have they gone? We failed each time. So like, what's different now? So it's usually this lack of self-awareness. And I think I had my own personal experience with with how this dynamic can play just on an individual level. When I was younger, I used to run a lot, and I was in great shape. And then got married, started a job, and fell out of the habit of doing things. And go to the doctor for a physical, and the doctor says, "Oh, your numbers aren't as great. Maybe you're a little. You need to get back in shape." And so the first day I go out there and I say, "Oh, no problem. I'll just go for a run, whatever." And I get out there, and even though I know that I haven't been running for a long time, even though I know I don't have that in me, in my mind, I'm not, or the facts say that I can't do it. In my mind, I'm thinking, oh, I could just do it, and I need to do it. So I go out for like a 3-mile run, and then of course I have no way of getting back because I'm totally incapable of handling it. My body isn't ready for it. I get an injury, and so now I'm really in trouble. And this is exactly what entities do. They're think of the analogy of an entity being out of shape and them trying to do something that is way beyond their capability. And this goes back to what we said the last time of maybe sometimes it's better to do nothing, because if you're going to add to this craziness of this idea that you're going to do some major project that requires major alignment and project management at a very high level, et cetera, and you don't have any of those things, you're just going to create even more waste and make the problem even worse than when it started.
And that comment that Jonathan just said helps me link some of my rambling sort of musings just a little bit ago, which about the maturity thing and why everyone's low relative to sort of an unknown baseline. I think, if you think about Jonathan's example and focus on the individual, make an analogy that you're thinking about your organization or the organization you're a part of as an individual. The maturity is not really coming to terms with the fact that I'm here versus where I could be. It's just being self-aware and acting appropriately. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we see that's missing. So I posed a question: how do organizations get caught in the cycle of low maturity? Well, it's kind of ironic because it's not because they lack capability, it's because they lack the awareness of their lack of capability. And they keep trying to do things that are beyond what they can do. Like the running example Jonathan is fleshing out, you have an awareness that you could be a great runner. You may even have experience of having been a great runner. But the maturity comes with the awareness in the moment that you have a certain level of capability right now. And that kind of limits you, or at least defines to a certain extent what's appropriate for you to try to be doing right now. And that's the catch 22, right? Which is you have to be aware of that to act on it. And I think that's where a lot of organizations stumble.
And a typical example is an organization that grows very fast. So maybe there were many acquisitions all at the same time, and now the entity's trying to do something that involves a platform across all these entities. So even though each one of these entities might be, have been very capable, and even if, everyone's really smart and, very able, et cetera, as an organization, their ability to do things across all these entities at this point, unless they've developed the infrastructure for it, is going to be pretty low.
And that's again the self-awareness thing is not as easy. Even if you could say self-awareness as an individual is easy, which I would even argue that can be complicated to say that you're self-aware of where you are as a single person. But then it's that organizational element that makes it that much more complicated. When Jonathan talks about, okay, we're scaling, even we're very capable, but now we're in a new context, and that makes us less capable, maybe relative to the situation. There's a level of awareness there that you need to call on. That's organizational. It's the sum of. It's you have to not just be a person or a CEO or manager to say, these are the capabilities we have and they're appropriate. You have to be able to speak for the entire organization when you're making organization level decisions. And in that, it's another element of maturity. Because how do you accurately account in any given moment for how mature or how capable your entire organization is, because anyone saying that, you're articulating it from maybe one person's point of view. Or if you're in committee, you can get people together and you can get an aggregate point of view. But brings us back to an objectivity element, which is, if I'm now 400 people and I used to be 50 people, how do you speak to being self-aware? What are the capabilities of your organization? How would you speak to them? Because it's not a known universe from a single person's perspective. And that, again, we're talking about a lot of communication challenges. We're talking about, where's the transparency between every single part of the organization at a given time? And I think if you're going to even start talking about organizational maturity, it's not about frameworks. It's first, what are we? How do you even articulate what you are when you get bigger? And I think that is a prerequisite to make a decision about, well, what can I do? If you don't know what you are, if you don't know you're in shape or you're out of shape, how can you then make a decision about, well, this is the kind of activities that I'm mature enough to accomplish?
And I think actually most entities, even throughout them, they know their maturity, even if they're not acting in concert with what their maturity actually is. They know. So, for example, you could say, "Well, what's your leadership culture?" And people will respond, "Well, there's a lot of politics here. You know, soon as somebody starts an effort, there's 5 people who are trying to destroy it." Or you have meetings and then people have the real meeting after the meeting, so nobody actually knows what we're trying to do. Like, in other words, there are a lot of symptoms and a lot of indications that you don't have the elements that you're going to need to do some sort of transformative level change. And people understand it. I think that the hardest part for most entities is they know they need to do something. There's a problem, they have a problem with quality, let's say. So they know they need to standardize or put measures on it. And so instead of being realistic and use the example of somebody who's out of shape and saying, okay, we're going to start by doing, run, or walk a mile, then we're going to start running a mile, like, and scoping things in a reasonable manner, they go straight to, let's get some major platform, let's get an ERP in here because that's going to solve the problem somehow. And let's do all this activity because we have a major problem and we need to show that we're doing all this activity. As opposed to, like Sam just said, being, understanding and being realistic with where you are and what you realistically can do at this point.
And part of that too, I would even question if people, I think there is an awareness, like you said, of, okay, this is where we are versus where we could be, or what we're missing, or this is more complex. But there's another level of awareness because people underestimate, okay, we can hire this team or we can hire this consultant and then we can tackle it. But again, it would be like the runner who's a little out of shape, who's about to contemplate a marathon, saying, okay, I'm going to buy some new gear, and they buy one shoe, or they buy one heart monitor, but they don't buy any new shoes. It's kind of like, what if I'm gonna boost the capabilities, I need to know how it's going to impact the organization as a whole. And this is what Jonathan and I see a lot when we're out in the field, which is, okay, you want to take on this big project and you want to hire maybe a few new people, but you're missing 10 years of experience. You're missing decision making maturity. You can't even talk strategy at the highest level. You don't have any alignment. You don't have these basics. And I think part of awareness too is awareness of the task you're trying to accomplish versus the entire scope of capability or awareness throughout the entire organization. And I think that's trickier because to the point, we both said it in different ways, Jonathan and I, in this discussion, which is, I think most of the time organizations can say, I know I could be better. Like, nobody's going to come if you ask them, like, do you think you're ready for this giant complex thing you've never done before? If they're modest, most people aren't going to say, oh yeah, we've got this. We've never done anything like this, but we're going to kill it first shot, super tough. We're going to nail it with just a little extra prep. I think most people would say, this is going to be tough and we need to be a little more mature to tackle this appropriately. But then even with that awareness, well, what's next? No one really goes the extra mile. And that's what, Jonathan, I think you were just pointing out, right? Which is that nobody then actually acquires what they need to cover the gap. There's some conversation that happens and then they tackle it anyway. They tackle it anyway with some gaps still in place. And I think that's where, again, now you have to question, were you really aware? Were you actually being honest when you were prepping for this project or this shift or this cultural change? And it's one of those things you have to ask from an observational level, what are we seeing? It happens over and over and over.
And I should clarify, most organizations throughout the organization would be able to identify the symptoms that then we could say they're not organizationally mature. the self-awareness, that varies, but I think that it's not like it's a secret. It's not like this is a complex thing to determine. It's really more being able to get people to act on it in a realistic way. And to use the analogy, keep going with the analogy if it's helpful. When people hire consultants, a lot of time, the equivalent would, let's say, be hiring a personal trainer. They think that somehow the personal trainer is going to make them in shape. But no, you're going to make yourself in shape. You have to do a lot of things. And if the personal trainer were to tell you, okay, we're going to enter in an Ironman tomorrow, and here are all the benefits of being in an Ironman. If you're in an Ironman, that means you can swim this fast, run this fast, do all these things. And that's a lot of times what's being sold is like, you hear all the benefits of this transformative project that you're trying to do, as opposed to saying, whoa, this doesn't make any sense. Like you're not capable. Doesn't matter how much you need this, you're just going to waste time, and you're going to hurt your chances of actually getting anything reasonable done. And I can give you a roadmap, but you need to do it. You need to actually absorb this and execute on it. It's not something that's going to be made happen to you, which I don't know, this disconnect, between like we have the paper from the consultant, suddenly it's going to actually make something happen. Again, it's at best hiring a personal trainer who can give you some tips on form and the best approach, but you really have to then do it yourself and do it in the stages that's realistic for you, prove out that you can do it, do some element of it, and then, grow from there.
And that's such an important point, which is that it's going to be iterative, and it's going to start from where you are now. And I think that if you talk about maturity and you wrap up some of the things we've been talking about, knowing where you are, knowing where you can realistically get to, it has to be iterative. And I think we're not incentivized to be iterative. Everyone wants to be agile, which is in its nature iterative, but nobody wants to be the guy who's sort of schlubby, out of shape, who hires a personal trainer and say, my gold medal is going to be to walk a mile tomorrow. Nobody goes out and publishes that, but that's the maturity. That would be the mature thing, because the person who gets up and says, I'm going to get this personal trainer, and in 6 months I'm going to be an Ironman athlete, everyone sort of encourages that sort of ambitious goal setting because it's attractive. And I think it's very trendy right now to kind of set a lofty or a big, hairy, audacious goal, and some of these things that people talk about and then try to plot there. But I think in that is the essence of immaturity in some ways, because there's no awareness. There's no awareness as an organization or a person. You don't want to be, it's not sexy to say, I'm going to take one step at a time and I'm going to be really good at that, because but even though that's the most mature thing to do, no one gives points for that. There's no props for that. And I think it's the same with organizations. And we have this problem all over the place.
And when setting off on these transformative projects, one of the first steps people often do is they hire the resources that they need, to be able to execute. So they get a bunch of project managers, they'll get a bunch, whatever the skills that they need. But that's the equivalent of, if you're out of shape, going out and buying all the gear that you'll need for an Ironman. Like, that's crazy. Like, why would you start at that point? Like, you could just go in your socks and sandals for the walk, like you don't need to even get the latest of anything. And in fact, by the time you're able to get into an Ironman, the equipment might be all different, or you might realize what you really need and not like what was sold to you. And the second problem is I'll start with the analogy, but when you have all this staff that's ready to go for this transformative project, you can't just let them be idle at that point. So at that point, you got to put everyone to use. And now all this activity is spinning up, but it has very little chance of being successful, because the entity has not worked through all the things that make you more agile. So governance, incentives, alignment, all these things need to be really addressed in order to be able to be successful. So maybe, Sam, we get into like, okay, so what can you do? So I don't want to be that cartoon, going crazy and wasting all this time and resources. So what would be productive for an organization that's immature?
Well, and this is where it comes back to the kind of line of thinking of don't do anything, which is the most unattractive thing you can say. I'm putting that out there as an energetic sort of note, like to slow down and take a breath. It's not
Sam,
actually don't do anything.
Sam, maybe we could say do no harm. How about
Do
that?
no
Instead of don't
harm.
do
Yeah, that's a
nothing,
better.
don't do things that are harmful. So do no harm.
Yes,
Everyone can accept that. It's they're used to it in the medical community. So go. Sorry,
that's
Sam.
true. That's a good one. Don't do it if it's going to be not adding value. Do no harm. Whatever you want to say. I think the theme we've been building up to here is being introspective as an organization, taking stock of where you are, doing things iteratively. This is wisdom. It's the tortoise and the hare. It's agile versus waterfall. That's the big trend, right? We all want to be more agile, but we're not willing to actually take things iteratively and do the right steps and be slow and conscientious in between different phases. So the what to do is always my first thing. Everyone's saying, okay, I'm chopping at the bit to get started. How do we solve this problem? How do we start building this strategy? The first step is always, where are you at right now? And that already is the problem. It feels like you're turning the other direction, and then you're doing some sort of inventorying or assessing or capabilities, taking stock of what capabilities you have. And that's exactly right. But the issue is nobody wants to do that. But you can never plow ahead if you don't know where you are. And again, in organizations, I know exactly where I am and I need to change. But it's again this impatience that we see everywhere, and it drives a lot of the waste. It drives the waste, it drives the wasteful spending, it drives the wasteful activity, because you never know where you are as an organization unless you take stock, because you're constantly changing. I think that might be part of the insight that I'll share for a first step. If you want to tell me that all of your capabilities and you're perfectly self-aware and you're the CEO of, let's say, even a 100-person company, and that was something that maybe you took stock of 6 months ago or a year ago, if you're contemplating something big and you're a mature organization, you need to take stock again. You need to see where your people are at, where your capacity's at, what your capabilities are, who you have on staff, what the market looks like, what vendors are out there, what are the solutions? Because now more than ever, things change faster than ever. There's so many more options every day, and your staff are different every day. You always have to start with the very unsexy first step of slowing down and taking stock where you are. So that's my first step, Jonathan. At the what do we do about this part of the
Yeah.
maturity to be more
The
mature?
sec the second thing I would be from my perspective, getting really good at being simple. And from when I say simple is many entities, let's say take the transformative activity, they're going to implement some major platform, some major enterprise resource system, for the entity. But nobody actually understands the business objectives that need to be met, or that they're hoping to be met from this. So people need to slow down and start with, why are we doing this? And everyone has to have a real good idea about why, because the systems might change, the technology might change, during the however long it's going to take to do this, and you might have to adapt, but you need to have a really fundamental idea about why, and you need to prioritize. So if I'm going to try getting in shape, I'm not going to start a new job at the same time and like have a million other things going on. I'm going to focus. So if you want to do something important, you got to prioritize and be successful in something, and then you could start growing. And I know everyone always then goes, well, we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Well, the problem is you can't. Every time you try chewing gum while you're walking, you trip. So like, let's focus on a priority. Let's focus on the why of it. What are we trying to accomplish? Does everyone have a very clear idea about this? Let's be really transparent about what we're trying to do, how we're trying to do it, who's doing what, etc. And scope it. Scope it meaningfully. Scope it small. Don't go all the way straight to everything worldwide, boom, because it's just going to fail. Or you're going to get something done, a system will be rolled out, and it won't accomplish anything. It won't actually meet any why.
Changing one thing is hard enough, and I just need to reiterate what Jonathan said. Changing multiple things at a time is exponentially harder. It's one of those things I learned in basic science class, which is if you're trying to run an experiment, you need to be able to isolate an independent variable and then toggle it and see what the impact is. And that's really stayed with me. And I know a lot of people know that, who are out there making business changes, but so many times I see people trying to make process changes where they want to flip 6 levers at one time. And they don't even know if it's 6 out of 100 levers or 6 out of 1,000 levers, because they didn't take stock of what they're even touching. And then how could you possibly measure the impact or what's going to happen when you do something like that? So I think that's a really important part
And
of that.
and the interesting thing is many times the reason the entity will take on multiple things at the same time is because there's this concept that one is going to make the other easier. So we're going to roll out a new system, and that system is going to make us all more efficient. No, that's two changes. So if you're trying to roll out a system, a new system for people, that's a lot of change right there. If you're then trying to use that system, let's say to align all your job, your job titles, and worldwide, so everyone's in the same, in a certain band for salary levels, et cetera, that's a second change. So you got to focus on one and then maybe put the system there. But you're not going to get some magical skip the effort that it's going to take to standardize everyone's job titles and pay scales by having a new system. That's two
Yeah.
distinct efforts.
Yeah. So we're building the rules of universal and general maturity right now on the fly, right? And we're saying number one, be self-aware. And this is honestly going to start sounding like what I'd tell a person to if I talked about how you be a mature human being. But you need to be self-aware. And to Jonathan's second point, you need to have focus and intent in everything you do. And I think that's an important one. And these are just fundamentals for if you're going to make organizational changes or organizational decisions. These are kind of focus is a big one. And he mentioned it sort of accessory to that point, which is transparency. And I'll use that as my third point. Be highly transparent in everything you do. Organizations that are mature know that you can get a lot of lift and productivity and efficiency simply by being more transparent. And when I say transparent, I'm talking about having everyone in the organization knowing the intention and knowing like how they're like what capabilities they have and what the goals are and what we're all trying to do, and everyone should know. So it shouldn't be like one manager or one set of executives knows what's going on and then it's distributed to everyone on the ground on a need to know basis. That would be not transparent in this context that we're using it. Being highly transparent is you've got data posted in public places. Everyone who wants to know what's going on should always be in the know, and they should be able to access that information. And just that as a general principle, you'll find that your maturity around most business dimensions are increased automatically. And we could probably do a series of podcasts alone on how having transparency with your data, your culture, your intentions, your communications promotes better process. But generally, as a rule of thumb, people who are more mature, organizations that are more mature, are more self-possessed, and they're more confident that what they're doing is the right thing to do, and they're willing to share that. And I think that's a big part of being transparent.
And I'll give you an example of transparency at a simple level. When we process map a process, many times that's the first time that people who are working with each other day in and day out find out what someone else is doing in the same process that they're engaged in. And so they say, oh, I didn't realize when I give you this data, you then do X, Y, Z. Maybe it would be easier for me to do, give it the data to you in a different format. That'd be more efficient. Everyone's like, oh, this is great. That's transparency. If everybody understands what the either the overall, well, definitely the overall objective of the flow that you're trying to, the value stream you're trying to get through, and what each person's doing in it, they can organically help toward that process. And this is the same exact idea writ large when it's strategy of an entity. And I think that if for some reason people think strategy is the domain, or what's trying to be accomplished is the domain of executives or something like that, and then everyone just does their part, and somehow we're going to orchestrate all this. But that's how you end up with all these crazy results where people are producing all these different things to try and roll up to the strategy or roll up to what you're trying to accomplish, and none of the pieces match. So when we say transparency, we're saying really, if you're going to hold information close, or you're thinking that there's some reason not to share it, you really better be better have a very good reason not to share it, and then question whether or not you can accomplish it without that transparency.
And that point too talks about when we started with, you can have maturity on one side of the continuum is very chaotic and one side very agile or very continuous improvement oriented. Transparency is what helps you get sort of on the other end too. If you think about, okay, what's sexy today is having a flatter org structure and not like a pyramid shaped org structure. It's being more evolutionary. It's being more grassroots. It's being more values based or family focused, or however you heard it. Whoever's listening, you've heard the different things that are kind of, this would make you a more desirable, mature organization. It all starts with that idea that Jonathan mentioned about strategy has to be for everybody. Strategy is not for the board. It's not for the CEO and his colleagues only. It has to be something that the whole company decides on. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. There's a lot of different ways to get everyone's opinion in the mix and get people from different parts of the organization to contribute to where you're going with strategy. But it starts with being transparent. It starts with being transparent that the conversation needs to be had, that everyone can be included, and that their input actually makes sense based on their position in the company and their expertise and their experience. And if you really want to achieve a high level of maturity and be one of those flatter organizations, that's where it starts. You can't have a flat organization when there's no transparency and decisions are made that half, if not the majority of the company is not aware of or not a part of. How can you ever be a flatter organization? You're always then going to rely on people just taking orders, or like Jonathan said, not knowing what's going on 2 desks down from them because they just don't have access to the data. So these things you hopefully start to see, they all align. They all align. Like being more mature in the ways we're talking about means that you get all the good things. You get your organization is naturally going to turn into all the good things if you just focus on sort of these core fundamentals of maturity.
An interesting thing you had also mentioned about, knowing where you are, all again on this idea that there's an urgency to get something done and to, reach some objective. People say, oh, we don't want to spend so much time on analysis or something like that. This is something we get all the time. But if you have no idea what your starting point is, how do you have any idea what you need to do to get to the next steps? So this concept of not taking a realistic assessment of where you are and understanding that that's going to have a major impact, and understanding how much you can then try and do, how long it's going to take, et cetera, is mind-boggling to me. But this is a very common problem that at least I see, Sam.
It's a huge problem. And actually, I'll share a little bit from my process mapping and my process consulting expertise, which is that 10 years ago, even nobody was talking about as process maps. Nobody, big or small. I remember I started in this space, and part of it is because there's a lot of holes right now in sort of a common process language. There's, we could get into that, but I'll table that for now. I mean, the idea that it's actually a lot of labor to map your process for very little remit. People don't like to read them. People can't really extract actionable data. People can't really say like, oh, this exercise that took a consultant or somebody internally several weeks to write down everything in an accurate way actually led to any results. For a long time, that held true. And like I said, even recently, nobody wanted that. Nobody wanted to do that. Every time you said, let's pause and see where we're at. Let's do an as-is diagram. Nobody had the stomach for it. Nobody had the patience. Nobody wanted to budget anything for it. But even now, there's starting to become, in the process space at least, more of a shift where people are realizing. I think COVID had something to do with this too. There's a little bit of a COVID because everyone's working from home and geographically dispersed and virtually. But we need to know what we're doing now. I think it was almost a false sense of confidence that you knew what you were doing if everyone is in the same office. But I'll tell you from experience, even then, people mostly don't know what they're doing, even when they're co-located. But the idea that you need to write down what you're doing and you need to pay people who are skilled at doing this, it's been distasteful for a long time. It still is. There's still a very heavy bias against it. And I was just confirming what Jonathan's saying, which is a lot of people have not been trained to see the value of the exercise. If your goal is as a manager or a leader to say, all right, let's get up and get this thing fixed. Again, the first thing that if you say is, okay, let's take a few weeks and write down in great detail what all is happening right now. It almost sounds like you're ignoring instructions. That's like the opposite response that people want, but it is so critical. I know
And
that was probably a long answer. Did I answer that question,
no,
Jonathan?
100%. But then the next step is, okay, now we have this, or we realize that when we, polled 5 teams, that each one had a very different process, and we're trying to do something that requires them to all have the same one. Okay, now your next steps can't be disconnected from that fact. You have to accept that this is really where you are, and that has an implication of next step. Again, organizational maturity, appreciating that you have this problem, and you're not going to just suddenly go and wave a wand and say, everybody start working differently. And it's not because people don't want to. It's not because people don't see the value and the benefit of, all the things that come from whatever this transformation is going to be. It's that it's very hard to go from that state to the next one. Just like if you're out of shape, it's very hard to tell somebody, okay, suddenly we're going to run an Ironman. Like, no, it's not credible. And that's the other thing that I see with a lot of these efforts. That again, like this, to the idea I said before, that people really kind of know where they stand. That's why these transformative efforts have such low credibility, and the vision statements that sometimes come out of leadership have such low credibility with the staff, because they know what's going on, and they also know that not me, I'm not going to be the one that's changing all this, or changing what I'm doing. So, the next step of if you do know your as is, accepting it and making your next steps be based on it is really important.
It is the tough, and it's funny because I'm thinking about the hundreds of use cases I have through my career where, okay, we even have the maturity to do the mapping because we want to know where we're at. And then to Jonathan's point, whoever commissioned the mapping already kind of sort of thought they knew where they're at and knew where they wanted to go. So then they look at it, they can't face the truth. It's like looking in the mirror and saying, closing your eyes and saying, okay, I did that exercise. Now I'm going to run the marathon anyway. Or like, I'm going to do the Ironman despite that exercise. So many times and now that we're talking about a use case of immaturity. So just to be clear, that would be sort of an immature response to doing an as is analysis and then not accepting the results of it and then augmenting or changing your plans accordingly.
I'm liking the analogy even more, because when I said Ironman, that's a solution. So, or that's maybe an objective that someone could set. But my objective when I started, because I was out of shape, was I want to get in shape. I want to be healthy. So the things I should be measuring is not how close I am to an Ironman. It's, are my numbers better? Is my blood better? Is, whatever it is that is the true objective. But the problem is that people equate solutions, and we're going to get into this in another episode, but people start with a solution like a system, a technology solution that's going to fix the problem, or whatever it is, or the Ironman, and then everything gets aligned to that solution instead of the why. And that's what I was trying to say before, is that the why is you want to get healthy. And if you could stay with that, then you can pivot. You can be agile in what you do, because as long as it's in line with the why, you have a better chance of it making sense. But if everybody's just working toward this goal of an Ironman, and by the time you get up to the Ironman, both knees are blown out, and you get to the Ironman and you barely could function, and even if you finish the Ironman, you're not even healthy anymore because you didn't develop the right things. That's where things really go astray.
And it comes again back to maturity in the sense that just like you tell your kid, about being mature, if you want to do the Ironman and then halfway through you don't like it, the mature thing to do is to acknowledge that and to change your course of behavior. It's not to say, don't be a quitter and push through and finish what you started, which is basically how most corporate projects work and how most organizations function. The Ironman of the corporate world is ERP implementation. And unless you're SAP, no one is happy about that. In fact, you're probably ready to put in your notice if you know what's going on, if you're going to be part of a major ERP implementation, because the why gets lost immediately. You don't remember why you're doing it. You're doing it hopefully to become more effective, more scaled, leverage more automation, become cloud-based, and have some of these benefits. But then as soon as you get into it, it's, we've got to get this thing in here as fast as we can, hell or high water, and it doesn't matter what kind of swath of destruction it causes. So you almost know that these kind of projects are going to cause millions of dollars of cost overrun. You're going to have major implementation problems. It's just, but we do it, but it happens over and over and over again anyway, because nobody remembers the why.
And the crazy part is, I've seen where these ERPs are implemented and people start creating all these processes to try and make the ERP work. So instead of like the original goal of scaling something, as Sam said, now you have all these new processes that crop up so people can still get what they're trying to get done to support having the ERP. And that's totally backwards, obviously, because that's not what people think they're buying when they get the ERP. But this is a very, very typical problem. So I think Sam, maybe we'll, like this is this leads to me anyway, and I don't know what you think, but a logical next step of talking about the transition state and the delta between where an entity is and where it's trying to go, and what that looks like, and the challenges there, because I think that'll start making some of what we're talking about a little bit more real. In terms of the org maturity, and sorry, I just realized I want to say one more thing. Sorry, the idea about, well, if we just walk a mile instead of trying to run a mile right away and, have 20 people running a mile, whatever, right away, we're going to go slower somehow is crazy. Because if in fact I set reasonable scoped goals for myself to get in shape, and the first day I walk a mile easily, okay, great. Now I proved it out. I'm going to up that. You'll be able to up that scale pretty quickly of activity to get to where you want to go, if in fact you can do it. But if in fact I have a real tough time walking the mile, well, now I know there's no way that it's going to make sense for me to do all this other activity all at the same time. So there's no correlation. Well, certainly we're saying it's the opposite, that if you try doing all this activity when you're organizationally immature, it's just going to be wasteful, and the opposite can be much faster, obviously. So.
And what I would say, and I agree, I think we can make this increasingly actionable, and we'll talk about transitions and transitioning from lower maturity to higher maturity, transitioning through project states in our next conversation. But I do want to say, from my perspective, it may have seemed very high level and inactionable in some ways because we're not giving you a step by step that you could just turn around from this podcast at your desk and start, checking things off a list or inputting data. But I think that this is imminently actionable in the same way that I would advise everyone that, your perception and your culture, if you're part of an organization right now, is contributing to the group's consciousness. Let's say it that way. So the more that you hear some of the things Jonathan and I are talking about, and you have your own ahas about, okay, maybe we aren't slowing down appropriately enough. Maybe we aren't being transparent enough. Maybe we aren't being focused enough. Organizational maturity starts with individuals being mature and promoting that maturity internally. Like, if your organization is going to be mature around the dimensions we're talking about, then it starts with people, and people agreeing that these are important concepts, important foundations in which we behave and we tackle problem solving and we assess problems. So I want to say that, I don't want you to wait till the next podcast to think, okay, we're going to give you some like amazing toolkit that you're going to be able to then start plugging numbers away and coming out with the right answers. A lot of this is actionable now, and I would encourage you to think about how you could take some of this conversation and be more aware and be more honest. I think a lot of this is slow down and be honest. Where can you get to? Because if you try to shoot too far, we've seen it over and over again. And this is another part that you consciously forget. You create waste. You create waste for the organization, and you're not helping the organization progress or evolve. When you think you take on more than you can, you're not going to run that Ironman if you blow out both your knees. You're never going to get there. So whatever you were hoping to achieve, it's just not possible if you're not going through some of the stuff we're talking about.
The good news also is, yes, no question, it could be a tome of information to explain how a particular organization can get from organizationally mature to organizationally mature. I think we're saying, though, if you're organizationally immature, keep it simple too. Like, in other words, so it is very actionable to say, do we understand the why of what we're doing? Are we focused on what we're trying to do? Are we being transparent about what we're trying to do? And and the like. So I think those, if an organization could say why they're trying to do something, and everyone who's involved in it could give the same why, actually, I think that would be a pretty big accomplishment, from my perspective. Because if the answer is because this is what they told us we had to do, or because we need this system, as opposed to why we need this system, I think that would be actually a major step in the right direction. Of course, I also can't help but plug the tool, because we're, this is all, democratized there, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's where the science, right? So what we're talking about is universally applicable. These are principles that when we talk about the tool is going to help you remember the fundamentals that get lost so easily when the organizational pacing takes over and everyone starts to hop into action mode. That's a lot of the theme of what Truvle wants to bring to the table, and I hope that's coming through, which is the ability to slow down and be more conscious and be more thoughtful about some of the things you do in an organization, which would sort of beget maturity, is not beyond anyone. It's just in the thrum of everyone moving. Sometimes we need help. We need reminders, and we need tools to structure our thinking so that we're consistent and we're always getting back to the basics in the right way. The inviolate basics that are going to lead you to good outcomes, as long as you have faith in the process fundamentals and you follow them.
And also these images we're trying to give you, I think we're always giving analogies to things. if you think about whatever you're trying to get done as an organization, what would you rate yourself? Where would you put yourself, in out of shape to very, to in shape? Do you consider yourself like a marathon runner with, transformative level activity? Do you have results to show it? Have you finished marathons before? Have you, did you place well, et cetera? And if the answer is no, well, then do the things that somebody would do if they're trying to get into shape. Have a good plan, prioritize, focus, take it at, in scale, it's in scope. There's no difference. It's the same exact thing, and the same exact waste is what you'll see if you don't.
Agreed. So I think that's a good stopping point for this episode. And Jonathan, unless you want to slip in a few more points. So what I'll say is thanks for joining us, and we look forward to having you join us for our next exciting conversation about transition states and kind of an extension of
And
this conversation, organizational maturity.
And please, we love the questions. Please post questions, because we'll answer them. And in coming episodes, all this stuff interrelates. It overlaps in many instances. So there's always an opportunity for us to come back to a topic and give you some more color to the extent it's helpful.
Mm-hmm. And with that, Sam and Jonathan out. Have a great week.